This is Sayeed Choudhury, and he is from Johns Hopkins University, where he did both undergrad and grad and has been working there for quite a while. He's currently the Associate Dean for Research Data Management. He leads the Open Source Programs Office and the Data Management Directive at Johns Hopkins. And he's been the PI of grants on all kinds of different federal agency and private foundation grants associated with data curation. And he was actually an appointee of President Obama's to the National Museum of Library Services Board. He's been doing lots of work primarily in the data curation space. So it's really exciting to have him here. And fun fact I found on the interwebs, he slept through his first earthquake in Los Angeles in 1995. There. All right, so I will turn it over to you, Sayeed, who I think you're going to be sharing your slides. Welcome.
Thank you, Carly. And if it makes anyone feel any better, I didn't sleep through my second earthquake, which was actually in Maryland, if you can believe it. And I do need to begin with a little bit of a disclosure. So as Carly mentioned, I have a long relationship with Hopkins, and the origin story of Johns Hopkins has always been about our founder being a staunch abolitionist and his family also sharing that because they were all Quakers. Well, the university made an announcement today. It turns out there really isn't any evidence to support that. And far from it, we have found evidence that he was a slave owner. So, you know, obvious questions and topics and thoughts aside, I in my own mirror gazing, I also have to ask myself why I just believed this origin story without questioning it, and seemed quite content to feel good about being in an institution started with a certain myth. But putting that aside, as we come to terms with our own history, maybe we can share stories about what we can do in the present and the future to have better relationships with various underrepresented groups. And that's actually one of the important themes I was going to mention anyway, even before this announcement was made, is open source as a way of collaboration and of working with people outside of the walls of the university. So this is the 25-second version of my talk. There was a slight probability because one of the websites we launched today is supported by my team. So I'm actually on call right now. So just in case I had to run off, I wanted to give you this 25-second version of what I'm going to basically say. You can read it just as easily as I can. But the main things are, I don't think I need to convince this audience software as a primary research object is one of the key messages. That there are best practices around software that have come up from the commercial sector, from the private sector, of which I certainly wasn't aware or fully aware, but I think we can learn a tremendous amount from them. And that there are three pillars of universities, broadly speaking. Of course, we do many things in the university, but research, education, and translation, which typically takes the form of tech transfer. But I'm taking to be more broadly is what are the outputs of research and education and how can they have impact in society? How can they have impact in engaging communities? And that I think open source software is a way to do this, and that the OSPO is a construct to make that happen. So this journey began with what seemed to be a fairly innocent conversation with another Hopkins alumnus named Jacob Green, also lives in Baltimore. He's a member of the advisory board for computer science. And Jacob has been attending community meetings for decades now in Baltimore. He lives in West Baltimore in a neighborhood called Reservoir Hill. He's very close to a community center there called the St. Francis Neighborhood Center. And came to me and basically said, I don't need to tell you Baltimore has lots of problems that need attention. What I can tell you is I think open source is a way we can start addressing some of these kinds of issues. And that open source has taken over the world. He had become connected to lots of people who had started open source offices and movements in places like Microsoft, Sun, IBM, Google, you name it. And that they all said, you know, we have embraced open source. It's the way we're doing things. But we just don't feel that way about universities. What's going on? Don't universities produce open source software? Aren't they interested in this? And I said, of course we are. And that started this conversation. And the first specific idea he raised with me was around a municipal open source software platform called Vitess that was created by the city of Paris. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a little bit, and whether we could do something with that in the city of Baltimore. So that's how all this started. It was sort of, I didn't think it was going to grow into an office and potentially a movement and a model and so on. But it began with the intention. I think it's important for me to remind everyone, the intentions were a way to work with Baltimore City, a way to take university open source and move it outside of the walls of the university. Now, this had a useful alignment or convergence with a fellowship that I had in the provost's office from January or June this year in 2020. Actually started a little bit earlier than that, but it was officially from January to June. And these provost fellowships are basically the provost plucks somebody from the institution and says, here's a key topic that should be of interest to the institution. Can you go do some sort of analysis or work around this and come up with a set of recommendations maybe? And he asked me to look at open scholarship. And this is where one of those points I made in the 25-second version was that I think open scholarship is made up of papers, articles, data, and software. But the points that I raised with him were that no faculty wants to be told where to publish their papers, right? If you go to a faculty member and tell them you should publish here, you can say if you publish in a gateway journal, here are the consequences, but you know, be wary in telling a faculty member, thou shalt publish in the following journal. So if you think of research as a primary object, then by extension, the question then becomes, why would you tell faculty where to publish their software and how to manage their software and so on? So one of the big questions is who owns open source software in a university context? And if you think about tech transfer, they have a very different motive, model, mission than one of engagement, social impact, and so on. I'm not saying they don't ever do those things, but it tends to be around commercialization. So this idea that software is its own research object and the faculty own their research outputs is one of the key observations that I conveyed in this fellowship. The other was that the infrastructure, the ecosystem, whatever you wish to call it, when you move from left to right, from papers to data to software, is far more established, right? We have publishers, we have long-standing journals. When it comes to articles, we have faculty know how to submit papers and so on and so on. If you move from there to data to software, what you see is there's less and less established mechanisms, workflows, infrastructure, players, you name it. And another important observation is the relationship with the private sector is very different. At best, the relationship when it comes to articles is sort of ambivalent. At worst, it's confrontational. That's not true with software. The private sector has actually embraced open source software in a way that's very different, and that actually they're looking for engagement and they're actually looking for ways to work with universities, particularly around curation, around sustainability. So we have an opportunity to interact with the private sector in a very different way with software than we ever did with paper or even with data. Then finally, this thing about data is the new oil, and I'm calling software then the new refinery. And you know, this is something you hear about data being the new oil, and somebody said, well, what about data being the new currency? And I said, well, then it's software's like the financial system, right? The banking system. And then somebody said, I saw a t-shirt that said data is the new bacon. And I went, I don't know, software's a frying pan. Okay, you don't have to keep doing this forever. But my point being, data is sort of the stuff that has to be refined, that has to be processed. And that software is the way to do that. So in reality, you get more insights into what data researchers are using, producing, analyzing, sharing by looking at their software than you do by looking at their papers. So in essence, I was saying we need to know more about the software if we want to learn more about the data than just by looking at the papers, which have a more mechanical kind of citation of data. So as this progressed along, Jacob, again, who had mentioned earlier, basically said, you know, do you know anything about OSPOs, open source programs offices? I said, I know nothing about OSPOs. So he pointed me to this group called the To-Do group. It's supported by the Linux Foundation in particular, but it has many contributors and partners now that run these OSPOs. This is a well-known construct in the private sector, and it typically focuses on things like software engineering practices and policies and license choices and best practices. And all of that is appropriate for university as well. So that's a very nice sort of set of foundational elements of an OSPO that translate very well into university context. But as you would imagine, you know, companies have a HR office and a legal office and so on, and so do universities, but they're different. We look at different problems. We have different kinds of ways of doing things. And that's very true with an OSPO. We can learn a lot from private sector OSPOs, but we have to adapt and modify them in the university context, particularly as a way of interacting with the private sector, other universities, and so on. For example, Hopkins, I'm told, a professor created some software about engine fatigue, plane engine fatigue, and Pratt & Whitney expressed interest in learning more about the software. And there really wasn't a very clear way for Pratt & Whitney to understand who to talk to, find out what the software licensing was, what the software development practices were there graduate students who are no longer there, all those things we might think about. So one thing that's interesting to me that I've heard from these companies is we don't understand universities at all. You're completely opaque to us. We don't know who to talk to, where to go to, and so on. So what occurred to me was that an OSPO can become this sort of organizational API. So one of my graduate advisors from Hopkins had a very interesting view about engineering. And he once told me that engineering is a liberal art. And I had no idea what he meant by that. And what he said is, sure, it's math, it's computation, those are all methods. You need to learn that stuff. But a good engineer fundamentally studies people, processes, and products and the workflows that connect them. So that's what you see at the top of this diagram, right? Is that the library is a place that sits in the middle of all those people, processes, and products at a university and looks at the workflows between them. And that's what an OSPO can do. So when you have all these things on the bottom, who are people we worked with through the OSPO since last year, they can now come to the OSPO rather than having to know which part of the university to go to. So in many ways, what I'm doing through the OSPO right now is acting as a clearinghouse, right? And it's a neutral, trusted service, academic service unit within the library. So this OSPO has become this clearinghouse, sort of a place that raised the capacity, the understanding, the awareness of open source in an actionable way. So that it makes it easier for entities outside of the university to work with us. So here's some actual tangible things we've been doing through the OSPO in just a few months. We established the first enterprise GitHub account. Now, you may think, well, is that really a big deal? Try to establish an enterprise account for anything in a university. Yes, it's a big deal. It took some effort. It took some sort of relationship building, but we did it. What does that do? It's the first step towards getting an actual inventory of what open source software we produce at Hopkins. If someone were to ask me what open source software do you have at Hopkins, I couldn't tell you. And I don't think anyone could. So we're trying to help answer that basic kind of question about what open source software do you produce, do you use at an institution, at a university? And we're working with a company called Liturgia to do some dashboards and have some analytics. I heard mention of the chaos framework in the first keynote. I know some of the folks in there are at your workshop. So we're working with them to think about metrics. How can the metrics they've produced be applied in the academic context is one of the key questions that we're looking at through this. Thank you, Sloan Foundation, for a grant to create what's called a free and open source software contributor fund. We're going to do that over the course of 2021. This is, again, something that's coming from the private sector. And the idea is that once you know what software you have, once you know what dependencies there are, you go through a voting process to say, this is an important module or dependency we use. We're going to actually support it with financial contributions. So this is the sustainability model for open source software. And again, that whole theme of adaptation is who's a contributor in a university context is a really important question, right? It's not just someone who did something on GitHub. It can be much more broad than that. The office is actually providing support for 2 open source platforms we're working with. I'll talk about it in just a sec. And then we just recently launched something called the Institute of Applied Open Source, which is doing something called the Semesters of Code. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. So Lutece is that platform that I mentioned that Paris developed. It's being used in Paris. It's been used for 5 years. It provides not all, but the vast majority of digital services for the residents of Paris, all the way from filing a 311 type ticket to applying for permits and so on. But even new novel things like participatory budgeting, 5% of the city of Paris's budget is allocated through a participatory process managed through this platform. So the citizens of Paris directly go into this platform, raise ideas, they're vetted, they're managed, voted on, and then the budget is allocated accordingly to those priorities. So it's a very different way of engagement, a direct way of engagement. I had the pleasure of going to a meeting in Paris last year where we met the deputy mayor who was talking about this. And he said, I think you Americans have this expression, be careful what you wish for. And there's a little bit of that when you have a platform which people can directly go to and say, this is what I care about, and so on. But I think it's fantastic. I think it's something that is incredibly important at any time, but probably much more than ever right now in this country to have this kind of direct engagement. So what have we been doing through the OSPO? As I'd mentioned, there's a community center in West Baltimore, the St. Francis Neighborhood Center, which views this as part of their digital strategy. So this was an important strategy they had before COVID. It's even more important after COVID, of providing digital services for their community. And it's the basic kinds of things like scheduling, activities or food drop-off points or things like that. But it's even more complex things like finding beds in homeless shelters. So one of the questions that comes to a community center is where are there available beds in a homeless shelter this evening? And I'm told by the director of St. Francis that it's basically phone and text, they know each other and so on. We can do this better, right, through software. There's clearly a way this can be done in a much more structured way. And that idea of who is a contributor, when we talked about this within Hopkins, a group of students went out and did some research and said, you can't just ask where there's a bed available. You have to ask things like, do some shelters, unfortunately, some shelters take kids? What about gender preferences for shelters? Some homeless people actually have medical devices that they have to plug in, so you have to have a low bed near an outlet. So these are requirements, right? These are software requirements I would not have thought of. But you have a group of students at Hopkins going out and querying the community, finding that. In my view, that's a contribution that feeds into something like the FOSS Contributor Fund. And the last thing I'll say about the Lutece experience is we've been working with the City of Paris and the Neighborhood Center now for months. Can you imagine what would happen if I had to go sign legal MOUs, data use agreements, and so on with these three entities, right? That would have taken months alone. So this is the sort of prime case of how open source is a way of collaborating, right? The license that it's a BSD-like license that Lutece is using is the framework, is the agreement by which we can work with Paris and St. Francis. We don't have to write a grant. We don't have to do the kind of legal agreements universities typically use. And I think that's a really powerful way of thinking about open source. The other platform that I mentioned earlier was the public access submission system. This is something that our library at Hopkins actually developed. It's a platform that basically allows you to submit articles simultaneously to your institutional repository and to PubMed Central, which is the repository run by the National Institutes of Health for about 9 federal agencies. This is supporting open access or public access policies. More recently, I have an NSF grant to extend this to other federal agencies and to extend it to data. So you could submit the article and the data to multiple places at the same time. And I can't go into the details because they're still being discussed and somewhat in confidence, but just suffice it to say that there's interest in thinking about PASS becoming a platform for multiple federal agencies to do this, right? So that's a great opportunity. Well, here's the problem. No federal agency is going to sign an agreement with Johns Hopkins or any single institution, right? So I had a set of conversations with the Eclipse Foundation, told them about this, and the decision we've made is we are now members of the Eclipse Foundation and we're in conversation with them about PASS becoming an official Eclipse product. And by becoming an official Eclipse product, federal agencies can potentially have MOUs with the Eclipse Foundation. And the Eclipse Foundation can act as the intermediary providing the service for universities. And make no mistake, I work with very talented people. We did this under extraordinary stress and circumstances, but we are having to show our code to industry experts, and they're going to tell us everything that's wrong with it. And that is a very nerve-wracking and very bold kind of step to take. And members of my team have said, really, we're going to do this. We're actually going, and I said, look, we've already put the code on GitHub. Yeah, but that's different than an industry expert going and pouring through it. And one very important distinction I've heard from several people in the open source community, there's a difference between open code and open source. You put your stuff on GitHub, it's open code. You put your stuff on GitHub, it gets vetted, it has a community, it has consistent contributions, it has consistent users that you can track through Bitergia and Chaos and so on. Now you're talking open source. So just having your code out there is not enough. You've got to put it out there, you've got to vet it, you've got to get a community of developers and users in a structured way. It doesn't have to be the Eclipse Foundation, but having some kind of external vetting is really, really important. So the most recent development is a layer on top of this OSPO called the Institute of Applied Open Source. And it is having a series of webinars and events where we've been very fortunate to have a lot of experts from the open source community volunteer and help us. And I think they basically are saying, we think this could be a model for universities, right? And if we can make it successful here at Hopkins, maybe it'll propagate into other places. But nonetheless, it's still very generous of them to put their time and energy into this. But perhaps the most exciting thing is this idea of semesters of code, right? So we've all heard about hackathons, and I'm kind of on a mission to turn hackathons away from this Red Bull pizza, stay up all night culture to something more. But they're just by their very nature, short bursts of intense kind of energy, right? Google has its summer of code, which is sort of an extension of that. It's a longer summer-long effort. You get to know each other better, but it's arguably Google-centric, which is totally fine. It's their program. I'm not being critical. But the semester of code is the idea that you would have a semester-long immersive experience for advanced undergraduates to work on a real-world open source project, to do it in a professional way, and to engage community directly. So the tests pass, maybe some of the things you're doing, are opportunities to get out of the lab, right? And sort of say, here's some real stuff, okay? There's some real software engineering practices you have to conform to that, by the way, these companies want you to know anyway when you're trying to be recruited. And here are the people that are going to use it. Talk to them. Don't just think you know what they want, actually talk to them. And understand that gathering requirements or UI or community managers and maintainers are just as important as the software developers. And I'm very glad to say that the chair of computer science has embraced this idea. He loves it. He was trying to redesign the computer science curriculum anyway. Hopkins has defined this sort of semester-like experience as being a key part of every student's educational experience. So it aligned very nicely together. We're going to launch these in fall of 21. We're getting a lot of help from some principals at Microsoft who are actually teaching, who will be part of the teaching of these semesters of code and are teaching some courses in advance of it as well. But we're really hoping this is a way to move all of this into the educational sphere as well, right? So it's not just software as a research object, it's as an educational experience, and it's all toward that impact and that translation in a real social and tangible sense. And the mantra I keep hearing a lot from folks is, open source is a verb, not as a noun. So it is a way of working together, not just producing code. And for universities, I think it's a much more flexible, nimble, and novel way of doing that. So it's been an interesting journey. There have been some folks that have been incredibly important in terms of supporting, including the Sloan Foundation, of course. I mentioned Jacob Green, and Denise Cooper is someone who's been very well known in the open source world, and she sort of took me under her wing, quite frankly, which was very helpful, but many, many other folks. And then here's some pointers to some of the resources. The OSPO++ group I mentioned at the end is one that's trying to take the OSPO concept and apply it in universities, government, and companies, and then build partnerships and relationships around that. But that's the story, that's the promise, and some of the early results we have. Be happy to take questions if we have time. Thank you.
Hey, so I had a quick question about a challenge that I've often experienced in the university world around these conversations of open source, which is that a lot of times people are kind of excited about contributing to open source as long as it's their open source project and not other people's open source projects. And in particular, like universities, they're incentivized to like plant a flag in things and be like, this is like the, my university flagship product, and so how do you imagine trying to incentivize that difference of like explicitly contributing something that you claim no intellectual ownership over given that like intellectual ownership is like the name of the game in academia?
Yeah, that's a really good and important question. And I don't have the answer for you in the short time that we have. What I can say is there are a couple of things that are critically important. One is attribution, right? So we haven't, in my opinion, we haven't figured out the sort of full complex set of attribution that's necessary for software, right? So come back to those research objects. Faculty write articles and they actually sign away the rights, right? They give rights to publishers and then we have to pay to get them back. They can't use them as reserved material in their own courses, right? Why are they willing to do that? Well, part of it is attribution, because then they can say, I published in Nature, or I published in Science, or so on. So giving away the ownership and the rights and whatever you want to call it, and sort of the credit, has to come with some attribution and recognition and reward in some other way. And we need to figure that out for software. And I'm not saying that it's a solved problem, but that's one of the key issues. The other is I hate to say it, it's a culture mind shift, right? It is a culture mind shift away from this is mine, I produced it, I'm the only one that can make it work, to I thought of this is has great potential. That potential can now be amplified by letting go a little bit of that control and releasing it to a community. And this happened with my team, with the past platform, right? There's a sense of, whoa, we're gonna start working with other people on this. Well, yeah, if you wanna scale it, and if you wanna make it more secure, and if you wanna meet the larger goals, you have to. It happened with the Parisians, right? They had never worked with other people on this platform. And in that case, we don't speak French, or I speak very little French. There's all kinds of issues that have to come up. But the overriding message is always, we can accomplish a lot more if we sort of open this up a little bit.
First off, thank you so much, Sayeed. Really wonderful to get to know about this initiative and to feel like, hey, this could be a model for a ton of other OSPOs, right? And other organizations, institutions, academic and otherwise, right? Municipal and so on. Once OSPO and the Institute for Applied Open Source, or Institute of Applied Open Source and so on, have a little bit more of a web presence and other, sort of continuing. Is that the thing? You're like about to get the OSPO website up, right? Yeah.
That's correct. Yep.
Yeah. Are there things that, are there resources or networks that you're hoping to tie into that we can provide on a semester by semester basis to help with the learning bit, right? With a semester of open source and things like that? Or are there particular topics that you really wish people might come in and lecture on or something like that?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question and the offer. So there's a couple of ways. So we have draft versions of all the websites. We had to focus on these other websites I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. So hopefully we will roll into those as early as next week. That'll be one place to look, and I'm happy to send email to Carly or anyone at CZI and say, please disseminate this broadly. The OSPO++ network is another place where I'd encourage you to look. There are regular gatherings there. That's the group that's thinking about organizing a series of webinars and talks. We're in the early stages of that planning, to be quite frank, so there's still opportunities there. The other thing I would say is the semesters of code are originally being thought of as Hopkins students, Hopkins projects, but that's not a given, right? We're still in we have I know 9 months may seem like a long time. I guess it really isn't to launch an entire new program. But we have a set of a mini course being taught in January where we're getting some students together to try some things out. And after that, we're going to design a curriculum, basically. So if anyone is interested in participating in that process of what would you like to teach students, and do you have a project or a set of resources that be relevant to that, please do reach out. I don't rule out the. Yeah,
do you already know about what Brandeis and Open Source Initiative OSI are doing?
Yeah, so a lot of the folks in the OSPO++, we've heard from Brandeis and RIT and UCSB and and Kat, I think, has mentioned some resources on the chat. Again, I view this as a model. In the spirit of the previous question, I'm not out here saying Hopkins thought of this first, we're the only ones that can do this, and this is the way it has to be done. We're part of an ecosystem that's already been experimenting and doing some stuff. And how do we all come together? At Hopkins, it's coming together through semesters of code. Maybe it'll be different in other places. But if you'd like to be involved in Semesters of Code at Hopkins, please do let me know.
Thanks so much.
Great. I want to be involved, but I'll talk to Dario about that. Thank you so much for the talk and the good discussion.